ways of assessing maximal isometric force production is an isometric mid-thigh pull. You could alternatively use an isometric squat, but you can't compare the force values between the two tasks because they do vary. So we tend to opt for maximal isometric mid-thigh pull because the isometric mid-thigh pull doesn't result in that compression throughout the spine or the pressure of the barbell compressing onto the trapezius, especially in athletes who are more slight in their build and maybe don't have a huge amount of muscle mass. It can be really uncomfortable and inhibit their performance. So for the maximum isometric force production, we're going to focus on the isometric mid-thigh pull. And what you can see here is the individual not changing joint angles, but aiming to drive their feet into the floor as hard and fast as physically possible. They're also strapped onto the bar, so grip strength is not a limiting factor. And because we're assessing maximum lower body force production, we have to use lifting straps. Irrespective of whether the athlete tells you they're strong enough and they won't lose their grip, you generally get somewhere in the region of about a 20% increase in force production when using lifting straps. So the key thing here is to make sure we standardize the performance. Now, the performance of this task is pretty easy to do. It's isometric, so the movement pattern shouldn't be incorrect. We get the athlete set up into the correct position first of all. So the correct posture is knees at around about 125 to 145 degree knee joint angle. So basically stand upright and go into dorsiflexion. Push the knees over the toes. And then the hips flex between 140 and 150 degrees. That results in the bar being somewhere around the middle of the thigh, hence the name mid-thigh pull. Now, if you've got long arms and a short torso, the bar may be slightly lower. If you've got short arms and a long torso, the bar will be slightly higher and up towards the crease of the hip. The key thing is that posture. Get the athlete to stand in a position when they're in dorsiflexion with the knees over the toes and an upright trunk. So on the uprights of this isometric mid-thigh pull rig, you should see the shoulders just behind the line of the bar and just behind the line of the uprights. No more than a 10-degree forward lean of the trunk, so somewhere between 5 and 10 degrees. Strap the hands to the bar, standardize both foot and grip width. That's a little bit different if you're working with younger youth athletes who may still be growing. But for anyone else, standardize their foot and grip width, and then get them in a position where there's a little bit of pre-tension and everything's rigid, but they're not pulling on the bar already. Now, they need to stand still on the force plates for at least a second before they actually start the pull. And depending on the force plate system that you may use, that will have different thresholds. It may be automated in terms of telling the athlete when to start the task. So the force plates you can see here from a company called Hawkin Dynamics, and they won't allow you to start the test, or they won't start the data collection until you've stood still for 1 second, which makes data collection much easier. Now, even though this is an isometric mid-thigh pull, we cue the athletes to push their feet into the ground as fast and hard as possible. And the reason we cue them to push is with some athletes, if they're not used to weightlifting exercises or performing heavy deadlifts, etc., when you tell them to pull, sometimes they'll pull with their arms. So cue them to push their feet into the ground as fast and hard as they can. The arms stay straight, the trunk stays upright. You may need to count them in depending on the force plates that you're using, and that might be 3, 2, 1, and then push. Strong verbal encouragement, so really shouting push, push, push as they're performing the task. Get other athletes around them, their training partners, etc., to encourage them as well, and then you'll get a maximum effort. So you normally do a dynamic warm-up first, and then we'll end up getting their athlete to perform a couple of sub-maximal trials, one at about 50% of their perceived maximal effort, one at 75, checking that the force time data looks correct and that they're not changing their posture or arching their back. And then you move on to 3 maximal effort trials with about a 1 to 2 minute rest between the trials. And for acceptable trials, we're trying to make sure that their force at the baseline, so before they start, represents body weight. So minimal pre-tension. There's no counter movement. They don't dip the chest first. And then there's a rapid increase in force production. And between the 3 trials, you're looking at no greater than a change of 250 newtons between trials. So if the athlete's generating 3,000 newtons on the first trial, and on the second one, they do 3,300, we discard the first trial and then repeat another 2 trials after. Normally, within 4 or 5 maximal efforts, you'll get 3 good trials that are all within 250 newtons of each other, especially if you let the athlete know that if they keep improving, you'll keep going, because they want and you want their best scores. They tend to put in a maximal effort from the beginning because most athletes don't want to do the extra training. And the 2 references on the bottom of the page here go through that in a huge amount of detail, the full testing protocol, if you want more information. So we get them in position, set the joint angles, as we can see here, knees over the toes, remain still for about 1 second, bar positioned at the start of the second pull phase of the clean, which is what we can see illustrated here, and the wrist strapped to the bar. From there, we get them to push as fast and hard as possible, driving the feet into the floor for around about 5 seconds. If you can see the force trace on the computer or the tablet that you're using starts decreasing after 3 seconds, you can get the athlete to relax. And the joint angle should be maintained. There shouldn't be any should be minimal extension of the knees or the hips during this task. And then at the end of it, once you see that decrease in force production, or after approximately 5 seconds, get them to relax. And you can see on this athlete's face here that they're definitely putting in a maximal effort. And you can see minimal change in joint angles as well. So it should look something like this. Maximal effort performance, force at baseline representing similar to their body weight with that tiny bit of pre-tension. So this athlete weighs just over 100 kilograms. So that's about right in terms of just over 1,000 newtons in force. No counter movement, the force doesn't decrease. And then there's a rapid increase in force and they peak pretty early on. So that's what we're looking at. And we would aim to do 3 trials. And as I've said here, we've got close to 4,000 newtons. So we're looking at each of the subsequent, if this was the first trial, making sure that they're not increasing beyond that sort of 4,200 Newton range. If they do, we discard the earlier trial and we just go with an average of the 3 trials that are all within 250 Newtons of each other. Now, the nice thing is with this test, apart from the warm-up, the testing itself takes about 3 to 4 minutes. So it's pretty rapid. And you can test a whole group of individuals in a relatively short time period. And it doesn't take a high skill level. It's really down to you as the coach to make sure you just get them in the correct position and cue them appropriately. So once we've got the data, once we've collected the data, what do we need to look at? The key things we need to look at are obviously maximum strength, so the peak force, the highest force they can achieve, but also their relative peak force. So the relative peak force is just their peak force divided by their body mass. And we want to look at that so that if the athlete is developing, if they have changed their body mass, are they now stronger relative to their body mass? If we're looking at comparing between athletes, a heavier athlete should generally be able to generate a higher force. So relative peak force is always useful to look at. In addition to relative peak force, we can also look at force at different time points. However, most of the time, we can't get particularly reliable force at under 150 milliseconds. So we tend to focus on 150, 200, and 250 milliseconds. And if we're emphasizing a period of training where we're really looking at increasing maximum force production, our emphasis is to observe changes in peak or relative peak force, but we'd still be mindful that we want to see some slight increases in rapid force production. If we have a period where we're focusing more on that explosive or ballistic force production, peak force probably isn't going to change dramatically, but then we'll really start to see changes in the force at 150, 200, and 250 milliseconds. If you don't have a force plate available, you can use a strain gauge or a crane scale. The strain gauge or crane scale generally won't give you force at these time points. You'll only get peak force, and then you can divide that by body mass to get relative peak force. So that's not a problem if you haven't got force plates available. We can just use a crane scale for it and just set them up in the same posture. Now, some people will also look at rate of force development, but if we get an increase in force at 150, 200, and 250 milliseconds, you will have increased rate of force development anyway. And if you look at this study by Professor Greg Haff in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research back in 2015, they compared multiple methods of calculating rate of force development. Now, that might seem strange because rate of force development is force divided by time. But what we can do then is look at the average rate of force development over a set time point or set time period, the peak rate of force development. We can also look at a moving average window. So looking at 20 milliseconds within maybe that 150 or 200 millisecond time period. And when you look across the research, people have done things differently. So it makes it really difficult then to compare your data to what's in some of the published research, especially if they haven't clearly identified how they calculated rate of force development. And the different methods can't be used interchangeably. So in our lab, we now generally use force at the specific time points instead, because you can't really calculate that differently. Whereas all these different methods of calculating rate of force development can end up leading to some misleading comparisons between the data. So generally we'll go peak force, divide it by body mass for relative peak force, and then also look at force at those different time points. Force at the different time points can also be expressed relative to body